Hey, you're listening to My Non-Objective Opinion on PeoplesRadioUnited.com. I'm Tim Best Buds. Today we're here with Jared Ware. He's a writer and producer of Beyond Prisons. On Twitter, he's at JayBeware. That's at JayBeware. How you doing today, Jay?
I'm good. How are you, Tim?
Pretty good. So today we're going to be talking about the prison-industrial complex and prison abolition. But I think a lot of people may not know too much about any of this. We've talked about it on some other shows briefly, but never in depth. So could you first off, just tell us a little bit about you and how you got involved in this kind of activism, if you could.
Sure. So, I'm 35. I'm basically self-taught in the realm of the prison-industrial complex and prison abolition. And when I say self-taught, I mean that I didn't go to school for it. It's not something that I learned little bits and pieces along the way in formal education, but most of what I have learned, if not all, has been through my own inquiry. But that doesn't mean that I haven't had teachers. So, I think the people that have taught me the most about these things are Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, Nancy Hetzeg, and all the folks over at Critical Resistance, which is an organization, and they run a website and a newspaper that's connected to prison abolition. And then, also the people I work on Beyond Prisons with. So that's Brian Sonnenstein and Kim Wilson. And then beyond that, and probably most important to myself, has been relationships that I've built with incarcerated people who believe in abolition, and learning from them and understanding from them about their experience and about how they see their experience fitting into history, and about what they don't see their experience as, and the things that are sort of put out there and discussed about the role of prisons within sort of civil society, quote unquote, that really are myths, right? That they're not really connected to any real reality of what's going on inside prisons or what prisons are actually doing to societies. So that's kind of my own background. I would say that in terms of where it started, for me, it started actually sort of connected to Black Lives Matter and connected to, really, so it's not, I'm not like long into this, but it has become something that I've focused a lot of energy around. But really back in like 2014, 2015, wanting to read and understand more about kind of circumstances around today's Black Lives Matter movement, and getting involved in sort of reading The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and then actually reaching out to people afterwards and saying, hey, I read this and this is crazy. Tell me about prison abolition. And so I've had great teachers along that way. And I think then for me also, the prison strike was another, last year. I was involved in some of the media work and communication work online, with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, connecting with the Free Alabama Movement, connecting with Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, which are incarcerated people's organizations that are connected to abolition. And, that took on a whole other world for me and got me even more invested and involved in it. So that's it's been actually a fairly quick arc for me. But I have studied a lot on it in that period of time and had a lot of conversations about it.
Yeah, that's kind of how it works with a lot of activists. I know you're working on things and something else catches your attention and you're like, wow, I didn't even know this has been happening all this time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to keep this kind of basic, at least at the beginning,
Sure.
because I think a lot of people, even though, like I said, we've touched on things with Kevin Cooper's story and a couple other things we've talked about, but I don't think, I mean, we mentioned on like a show or two ago about the prison-industrial complex and how there's more people in prison in the United States than the next top three countries, one of them being China,
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. But can you just kind of briefly explain in layman's terms what the prison-industrial complex is, what we mean when we be talking about it, and just kind of how screwed up it really is?
Yeah, so, on a basic level, I think that the prison-industrial complex is this sort of nexus of government and prisons and security-related industries. And when I say that, like, I'm talking about border patrol, I'm talking about police, I'm talking about privatized security, I'm talking about all types of detention centers. So whether that's juvenile detention, whether that's private prisons, whether that's immigrant detention facilities, private immigrant detention facilities, ICE vans, and the sort of, all the way to your local county jail, state prisons, federal prisons. So that's kind of part of it. Now, Angela Davis actually talks about it in global terms, right? Because you have corporations, and so it's that, and then it's also all the corporations that are connected to this and the profit off of this industry, basically. And then in global terms, you're talking about multinational corporations. So there's a corporation called G4S, which is the third largest private corporation in the world in terms of employers, like in terms of number of employees. And it operates everywhere. In the U.S., mainly what it does is it does like private security for places like Bank of America and stuff like that. And then they also do, like, you'll see people that look like cops that have like a G4S patch on their arm if you're in some major city. And then beyond that, what they do is they do a lot of the like transportation of immigrants between detention centers or deportation and things like that. They also were, but in terms of looking at them internationally, like they're a UK-based company. They were the employer of the Orlando shooter. They in Israel and Palestine, they were the ones who operated the wall and a lot of the detention centers there. So you have like this, it's like this largely growing complex of these corporations that make a lot of money off of, putting people in cages, selling their labor or utilizing their labor for free. And then horrible, like there's tons of abuse in these places, and that doesn't matter whether they're private or public. And I think a lot of times this is where the private prison conversation a lot of times gets messed up, because it's like, yeah, private prisons are messed up in a lot of the same ways that public prisons are. What's particularly dangerous about them is just that they actually become this very expensive, very wealthy lobbyist for more incarceration and for more carceral policy. But, basically at its root, the prison industrial complex is a large industry that's made up of governments and corporations that make money off of people being locked up. So there's the profit angle, and then there's also the social control angle, which I think sometimes people want to say, well, are they about social control or are they about profit? Well, they're about both. It depends on who the stakeholder is, right? To a private prison company or a company that utilizes free labor or slavery, right, within prisons or detention centers, then they're a profit mechanism. For a lot of other people, for politicians, it sometimes is more about like this notion of law and order and security. But those things are not they're tied together, right? You can't like, it's sort of like capitalism and racism are tied together. You can't just like look at them completely in isolation because they're so intertwined.
Yeah. And obviously, if you have prisons and they're profiting off these things, then what they want to do is get more people into these and build more of them and profit more, which leads to what we have now, like a police state and militarized police in the streets and criminalizing pretty much everything anyone can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are a nation of laws, right? And that's what we're always told. And but every, I always think about it, especially, and this is, and I know we'll talk more about what abolition is, but sort of a fundamental idea around abolition is like, do we create more laws to try to fix problems, or do we try to take away laws that are bad? Because a lot of what ends up happening is you criminalize people for a whole host of things, and typically, like overwhelmingly, what we criminalize is poor people, is people of color, is immigrants who are usually poor and people of color, and so it's not a system that's designed to hold accountable really wealthy people, and really wealthy people tend to have the resources at their disposal to figure out how to commit things that we would consider crime if I did it to you, but if Bank of America does it to 100 million of us, it's not a crime, and so that's it's very much focused on the social control and the profiting off of people who already don't have very much, and for the benefit of the people who already have a lot.
Yeah. I've done a few shows on Kevin Cooper, who's a man who's on death row in Northern California. Mm-hmm. And he said the one thing everybody on death row has in common is they're all poor people.
Yeah.
And that was just like, I mean, I knew it, but it's like when you hear somebody that's right there say it and realize it, it just kind of like, it rings home, and it's like, wow, that's messed up. And I mean, things simple as traffic tickets. I mean, I went into court years back with like $700 hard-earned money. It was gonna, like, how am I gonna pay bills now? How am I gonna do this and that? But I gotta pay this fee or go to jail or get a warrant or something. And some rich person comes in and doesn't even show up, has their assistant come in and pay their fees and do their thing for them, and they're done, and it's not a hassle. And
totally,
it's the whole way up the criminal justice ladder from misdemeanors to major felonies. You're right. The wealthier the person, the more advantage they have, which, if justice is blind, it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most compelling documents to me about all of this, and it's like, it's a really fucked up document, when you read it, but like the Ferguson report, which the Department of Justice did, if you read that, like, and I think, like, people from Ferguson will say Ferguson is everywhere, and it's true. There's nuance, right? There's different ways that laws are implemented different places, and there's different, sure. But like, by and large, it's not like Ferguson is some complete aberration in America in terms of how they police. And basically what it documents is a city that is basing its budget off of how much money they're going to extract from poor people through fines and fees, and particularly through black poor people in the case of Ferguson. And it really lays it out, like, in very compelling terms, and the frustrating, I think, thing about it, right, and the thing that sort of reveals, sort of the priorities of the U.S. government is that it's like, well, then what are you going to do about it? And there's really there's not a lot of teeth. And now that obviously, Obama had like slightly better inklings on these things and had a DOJ that was a little bit more interested in sort of exposing and examining some of this, not necessarily doing anything significant about it. but at least like raising it and being comfortable as a government sort of exposing some of this. Whereas like the Jeff Sessions DOJ has basically said, like, we don't even want to honor those consent decrees. We're not interested in continuing to tell police how to police the country. In fact, we want the war on drugs to be ramped back up again and, start locking up more people. It's good for America. So, it's like, but as like one of my incarcerated comrades, Bennu Hannibal Ross' son, has said to me, he said, having Obama be president didn't change the color of paint on my walls, and neither did, he's like, I've been in here since, 94 or something like that, and he's like, no, there's no difference when you're in prison, basically as who the president is.
Yeah, we talked about how both parties kind of support the same corporations, and just it manifests in different ways.
Totally.
But, with the fires in California right now, I think I told you in a DM, I was reminded about like fire camps and stuff like that. Yeah. Where they send people out, like let's look at it like this. The average person says, Ivanka Trump is getting stuff done in sweatshops in China, and they're not paying these people right, and it's horrible, and it's slavery, and blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. But then you look to the prison system here, and the same thing's happening, but nobody seems to get outraged about it on a mass scale. Yeah.
So the fire one's really interesting. So, I mean, prison slavery is it's a lengthy topic. And at some point, maybe we can talk a little bit about sort of the history of that. But right now, I mean, I think the fire thing is something that it's brought a lot of people's attention. There's been some big articles written about the sort of like there was a group of women firefighters who are paid $1 a day or whatever to fight fires in California. I grew up in Southern Oregon, so it's interesting. This is something that I actually knew about from my childhood, and it's part of like one of those things where there are certain things that you don't interrogate that much about your own society, and prisons in general are one of those things about American society. Prisons as a form of punishment, it really didn't take off until the 19th century, and yet we treat it as though every society has always had prisons, that it's just a given. But in Oregon, those inmate labor fire camps are a part of the government's, they have like a standing camp for people who are incarcerated that are a part of these fire teams to stay at and to, be transported out of to fight fires, because there's wildfires every single year in Oregon. And so it's actually this partnership between the Forest Service there and the Department of Corrections there in the state. And, they're paid, I think in Oregon, they're now paid $2 an hour, if I'm right. I'm not positive on that, but it's I know
somewhere it's something close to that, even in California.
Yeah. And in some places it's nothing. In some places it's that like a day as opposed to an hour. But basically in the West, especially like in California, in Oregon, in Washington, in Idaho, and Nevada, if you live out there, that there's like these huge wildfires every year. And a lot of the people, in fact, in some places, and then maybe in all of them, a majority of the people that are fighting these wildfires are incarcerated people that are paid next to nothing. And, it's interesting. One of the things about it that gets brought up is like that many of them volunteer for this. And so you have to think about, like, I always sort of flip that on its head and think, well, how bad is the prison if they're willing to go volunteer to risk their life and inhale a bunch of horrible smoke for $2 an hour, right? Like, it's not that like they just suddenly have like a greater calling to fight fires than any of the rest of us in society, right? It's just that their options for how they go about their day are so horrible that actually sounds like a little bit of relief for them. And I think that's, it's an interesting thing, right? And I think when you think about prison slavery in the context of chattel slavery too, it's like, well, there are certain roles on the plantation that people were more comfortable with, right? That were better than others. And it doesn't mean that the institution itself wasn't horrible. We all know that it was, right? But you didn't want the worst jobs on the plantation. And it's kind of similar in terms of how labor is in prisons. You're in this place where your options of how you handle your day are very limited, and none of them are good. And so you're forced to make these sort of, choices that how many of us live in states where these massive fires, and so few, I know my godfather growing up, this is how I know about the inmate labor, and my godfather growing up used to fight fires every summer to make extra money. But he was kind of like an exceptional person in that, one, he wanted the extra money, and it pays decently if you're just a private citizen. But on the flip, like, he was somebody who, that was part of who he was, right? Like, he cared about his community and his state and trying to make a difference in that way. But that's not like the default for most of us. I've never made a decision to go fight a fire, like, even though it would pay me, right? And so I think that, because it's very dangerous. People die. One of my next door neighbors growing up died because he got, he was out fighting a fire in our area, and he got, on the wrong side of a fire line or whatever, and he got trapped and encircled, and that's what can happen, and burned alive, so. And that happens, if you go back, somebody asked me about this inmate labor thing, and if you just Google articles, right, about like incarcerated firefighter dies, that kind of stuff, like, you'll see results year after year after year of women, of young men, and I'm talking people like in their early to mid 20s, that were burned alive fighting fires to protect the property for the rest of us, right? And probably in most cases to protect property of people very wealthy. So that's been an interesting thing to watch that come up. I think, one of the things that I think is happening just quickly is that there's a lot more focus right now on the 13th Amendment, which the 13th Amendment, for those who don't know, was the amendment that we think of historically as abolishing slavery. And there's a clause within it that says, except as punishment for a crime for which you are duly convicted. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically it. And so what that means, and what it did mean initially, right, is that once everybody was quote unquote freed from chattel slavery, but once you were convicted of a crime, then they could put you right back on the plantation. And that's what happened. That's what there was a system called convict leasing. There was the whole system of like debt peonage and sharecropping. So these were all like forms of like continuing the same slave economy basically through other means. And then that's evolved over time and transitioned over time. And a lot of the reason that it's transitioned in different ways is just because the economy has developed in different ways, right? And so, we don't need like millions of people to pick cotton anymore. That's not the type of slavery that capitalism still needs. But capitalism always thrives on slavery because that's how the wealthiest people can make the greatest amount of profit, right? Isn't by not paying their workforce at all or paying them next to nothing. And so this, has been exposed more recently due to things like the national prison strike last year, due to, Ava DuVernay's The 13th documentary. Sorry, I'm going to get a drink of water real quick.
All right, no problem. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so, So slavery's been highlighted within prisons due to things like the prison strike and due to things like Ava DuVernay's The 13th documentary. And also, I mean, there's interesting flashpoints around it. Like this year, there's been a passage of Hillary Clinton's book that was brought up, right, that showed that when she was in Arkansas at the governor's mansion, that there were prison slaves there, right? And it's interesting because this book was written in the 90s, but nobody thought anything of it at the time, right? It was never brought forth as like this horrible thing. It wasn't even brought up during the presidential campaign, even though we know that thousands upon thousands of people had read this book. But somebody uncovered it recently this year and brought it out. And it was kind of timed around the same time that Sam from Campaign Zero was talking about his experiences going down to Louisiana and seeing, which Louisiana, like there's certain states where prison slavery is just like on steroids. And Louisiana is one, Texas is one, Florida, a lot of the South, it's crazy. Like it's like literally prisoners being taken out with guards on horseback with guns to work on plantations that were literally plantations pre-slavery.
Wow.
It is still that. Like Angola prison in Louisiana was built on 4 slave plantations, and its first lockups were literal slave quarters. And it still exists today and still produces millions of pounds of food, of produce a year. That's all harvested by prisoners that aren't paid anything. And so like that is like one of the clearest linkages of just how like you could literally just follow the history of those 4 plantations from whenever they were first put together to now, and just watch the development of different like forms of slavery that really don't even look any different. Like you look at it, you see pictures of it or video of it. And there's some good like documentaries and articles about Angola prison, which is the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Angola is like a sort of nickname for it. But that's sort of, in some ways, it's sort of a prime example of it. It doesn't always look like that, right? Because it wasn't. You have forms of prison slavery in places like California and Oregon and Idaho where there was never chattel slavery, right? So it's different in different places, but the fundamentals are very much the same in terms of it's always people doing a lot of labor for so little money. And there's these misconceptions too that like prisoners don't have to pay for anything, which is also not true. And that varies a lot from state to state, context to context. But like, in order to get anything other than prison food, which is horrible, you have to go through commissary and pay 2 to 3 times what we would pay to buy the same things. If you want to talk to your family, then you have to pay a phone service that is, charges just insane rates. Now they're trying to take away visitation some places and replace it with video conferencing, which costs an insane amount of money. And so there's all types of things that, and besides that, you still have a family for most people, or for a lot of people. They still have people on the outside that they would like to be able to help support. They have, in many cases, child support that they would like to pay. Yeah. So those are all issues. And if you can't earn some form of income, then it's not just that you can't contribute in a meaningful way, but you actually become an anchor, right? You become, you become a negative, you have a negative impact on your family and on your community that you can't control.
Yeah. Well, what would you, I hear a lot of people, really ignorant people generally saying, oh, these prisoners have too much nowadays. They have televisions and curtains and blah, blah, blah. And then, and what would you say to the person that says like these people are criminals and they deserve whatever they get? They don't deserve to be treated fairly anymore. They gave that up when they committed the crime. I hear that so much.
Yeah. No, I get it too. And I think, in some ways there's so much to unpack there that sometimes it's very hard to do in a quick conversation. I find like, I like to use Twitter a lot, but I find Twitter completely inept in terms of like breaking something like that down for somebody, because 140 characters at a time is just not a way to really do it. I always encourage people to actually like read things that are fairly substantial about the subject, because I think that it's not like I think about the way I became an abolitionist, right? And it was not through like simple conversations with a person here or a person there. It was through like reading The New Jim Crow, and then reading Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, which that's a really great starting point. And actually, Beyond Prisons, we did an episode where Brian and Kim broke that out. So, in a half an hour, you can sit and listen to that episode. I mean, an hour, you can sit and listen to that episode, and come away with a pretty good understanding of some of the basic concepts around it. But I would say, just to that person, like fundamentally, there's some things that I tend to disagree with that person on. And usually it has to do with how does crime, what is the role that criminalizing things in society plays, and who gets criminalized and why, and what led that person into crime. So I tend to try to look at like root causes and look at the overarching structures in society and how they contribute to things. And so, for example, to the person who says, they committed a crime, the question is, right, is if you commit a crime, right, if society deems that something is wrong, that we shouldn't do it, then how do we decide what happens to a person when they do it, and what is a justifiable or reasonable way to deal with that situation, right? And so our society is based on punishment, right? Like, so we think when somebody commits a crime that we need to punish them for it, which, I don't fundamentally, I don't really understand that idea, right? I mean, I think like when you think about how you raise your child, like there's been research over years and years and years that basically it shows that like just punishing your kid, like beating them or like, locking them in a closet or, forcing them to labor for hours on end, like things like that. Like we say stuff like that is illegal, right? If you do it to a child. But yet, like when we think that, okay, a 16 or 17-year-old kid could commit a crime, be tried as an adult, and spend their life in prison, like these sort of, there's very little logic to that way of thinking, and there's very little reason to think that punishing somebody for something makes society better, right? So like their rationale is that it'll deter people from doing the same thing a lot of times, right? Like, okay, if the punishment is so bad for the crime, then people won't want to do it. Well, that is like, there's no theory that's probably been proved more false than that historically, because crime continues to stay fairly consistent or even drop, and yet prison populations continue to expand. And so there's no relationship really between these things. The idea too, and we talk about this, and you talked about the poor people, how everybody on death row is poor. It's like there's certain people in society that get what we would call abolitionist sentences, or sort of restorative justice or transformative types of sentences. And they're usually people who are extremely wealthy and can afford really good lawyers and can make good plea bargain deals with the DA. And they usually end up with very little in terms of, they could commit a heinous crime and I wind up with very little or no prison time for it. And then you can have somebody that, sells a certain amount of, weed in a state and goes away for 25 years or something, So the sort of rationale behind it is very bad. And then I think the other thing too that and this is something that people that are right wing don't like to talk about and don't really acknowledge. And I don't know why, because it impacts them as much as it does anybody else, really. But like, there's so little opportunity for living wage jobs in our country, right? And so much of crime is related to that in some way or another. So much of crime is related to people who can't make ends meet. And so then, because they can't make ends meet, they either resort to some sort of criminal activity as a source of income, or as a way to, like theft, drugs, like all of these things can be connected to a way to get yourself more income. And then on the flip side, you have basically, you have a lot of different crimes that are related to this sort of like using drugs, right? Like using opiates, like a lot of this stuff, this grows in areas where there are no jobs, right? Because it's like people lose their sense of, how do I contribute to society? How do I become a meaningful contribute to society? And they use more drugs and abuse more drugs as a result of that. And their life kind of spirals downwards. And then when you're addicted to something, we don't have a good healthcare system, right, to help out with these things. And healthcare is a huge factor in the increase of the prison system, really. That you don't have a healthcare system that helps people to be able to afford to get off of drugs. And so then, they get hooked. They eventually can't afford their prescriptions if they're on prescription drugs. They resort to the black market because it's cheaper or whatever. Like, so there's all these different things that happen, and it can just kind of spiral. And anybody that's ever lived in like, a small town or a city that's been deindustrialized because a lot of jobs that were living wages have left and gone to other countries. They've been outsourced or exported. Some of their jobs have gone to prisons. You see this sort of fallout, right? And then drugs tend to increase. And so that's part of it. But I think there's another piece too that's important to talk about. And some people have started to raise this more recently, which is how we talk about violent crime in America. And sort of we have to deal with this too, because there's a lot of people that are in prison for some form of violent crime. Usually like assaults or, and also crimes related to, different types of like, whether it's rape or, statutory rape, all of these things. And the key, I think, there's a couple pieces, like, and this is much harder to deal with. And it's even something that people struggle with within abolitionist circles to talk about. But the key is to think about, like, what does putting a person away in prison for the rest of their life for these things do? Like, functionally, how does it help society get better? How does it help to deal with the crimes that they committed? How does it teach them or retrain the behavior? A part of what we claim that prisons are about is rehabilitation. Well, if you ever talk to prisoners about what prison is like, there's nothing that goes on within it that's connected to rehabilitation. There's nothing it does the opposite. It takes people who go in because maybe they committed a crime, or maybe they just couldn't afford a good defense and they got convicted of something, or they took a plea bargain deal, which there's like it's something ridiculous, like 95% of all people just take a plea bargain deal because it's like, they're going to get a better deal, whether they did it or not. They're going to get a better deal by just saying, agreeing to take what the DA says. They can't afford a good defense. And they get stuck in this position of like, okay, do I take 2 years and 5 years probation that they're offering me right now, or do I face 25 years in prison, right? And like, that's like, it's a position where it's like nobody wants that situation, like, because you're thinking, shit, I could have to give away a quarter of my life or more into this system, or maybe I can just give 2 years and then be done with it. And I think like, so, there's all of these things that are factors within it. And like you say, it's usually people that really can't afford to play the game. It's usually people that really can't afford to deal with all of because the system's very powerful and very strong, and that the connections that exist between police, between police, district attorneys, and judges in this country, it basically is a railroad for people. I mean, we have these discussions about like kangaroo courts in other countries and stuff like that, but like, I mean, even the cash bail system in our country, this is one of the amazing statistics that I uncovered a while back. There are more people that are in prison that have not yet been convicted of a crime in this country than there are all the people in India in all of their, convicted and otherwise in all of their prisons. And India has over 1 billion people. So like you're looking, and India, by a lot of people's standards, is considered a sort of fascist country. I mean, like the way that they respond to some of their activists and dissidents from different, ethnic groups or religious groups, like is very strong and harsh, and they kill people, they lock them up. Like it's brutal to a lot of people. But when you just make that comparison between India and you mentioned China before, like these are countries that we can't even fathom how large they are because there's so many more people in them than there are in our country. And yet our system is bigger than them. And in the case of India, we have more people locked up who haven't even been tried than they have in their whole system. So I think that, like, when you start to look at things like that, it really opens your eyes that, like, it's not like this is just a little bit out of whack and that there's a little bit of reform. Like if we just tweak this and, make a little bit of a change, like maybe we should only sentence people for 2 years instead of 5. Like those are important conversations to have, but like this is messed up. Like you can't, it's really beyond anything that's rational, or that can really be defended when you look at the whole totality of it. And that's why I think it's hard for me to have those little conversations with, Jimmy, who thinks like, you do a crime, you do the time. It's very arbitrary a lot of times what you end up getting, how you end up getting impacted by the system. I had an example from my own life, and this was kind of profound for me. So when I was in college, I got pulled over my senior year, and basically it was a DUI stop. And, I probably was borderline. I didn't do a breathalyzer, but I was white. All the friends that I had in my car it was one other white guy in the car. 2 of my friends were black who were with me. And, it was really interesting. One of my best friends, he's from Haiti, moved to Boston when he was like 10 years old or whatever. But he's had terrible interactions with cops his whole life, right? He's sued the police before and won. Like he's just been, mistreated by them his whole life. He's used to it. And he was pissed off immediately and just like, he had a sense that things were going to go bad. But I was able to talk through it, right? Use my privilege. I was the one driving, thankfully. Kind of say, hey, look, we're like a week away from graduating, dude, and my house is right there, and like literally pointing down the end of the block because I was right there. And just acknowledging that like I was the designated driver. I was the one who was most sober out of everybody, even though I had had a couple drinks. And they let us go, and so it was like this moment, like, and this is, I think, an experience that probably a lot of white people have had at some point or another, where they've had an experience with a cop where they like, oh, they let me go, so I don't think cops are that bad, right? They generally will give you the benefit of the doubt. So like that happened. 6 months later, I was living in Jamaica, Queens, and my roommate was driving. My roommate was, he was multiracial, but he grew up in Jamaica, or he grew up in Brooklyn. His parents were Jamaican. And, basically, so we got pulled over. We got pulled out of the car. We were doing nothing wrong. Like we were totally sober. There was nothing, like we were on our way to the ATM. And they, you know, without a warrant, without our permission, they started searching the car. They pulled out a roach, you know, that was in his ashtray, a marijuana, you know, roach that was like weeks old, right? And tiny, like not something that you could smoke, just like the remnants, right? And they used it to lock both of us up. And you know, it was baffling to me at the time. But what happened is they put us in the back of the paddy wagon in the, you know, police van, and they rode through Jamaica, Queens for like 5 hours. Maybe it wasn't that long, maybe 3 hours. And all they did was they picked up people that they knew were drug addicts, that were in the community, that were out in the street. None of them were doing anything like wrong at the time that they were picked up, right? They were just like walking along, and they knew like these people are holding, right? These people always have something on them. And picked them all up, and we spent a night. You know, we went to the county, or we went to the precinct, and then they transported us to Kew Gardens, which is where the Queens County jail is, basically. And we spent the night in there, and it was all poor people. I mean, everybody in there they were nice. Like it was not a situation where I like got in there and thought like, oh man, like this, I'm surrounded by all these horrible like killers or whatever. Like, and granted, like they'll segregate out different sets of people that are in jail or whatever. But like, but you know, and then like the next day you get legal aid that talks to you, right? And I tell them like, look, this was an illegal search. It's not even my car. It's, you know, I was just riding in it. I had no idea like what would be in it. You know, like I'm explaining the whole situation. I'm explaining. I was never Mirandized. Like nobody ever read my rights or told me what I was being charged with. You know, and so I just went through it all as like, hey, I'm a college educated kid. I know what, you know. And the guy said to me, he said, look, he said, I'm not here to defend you. He said, like, if you want somebody to defend you, you got to find a lawyer and hire him. Like, I'm here to tell you the plea that the state is willing to offer you. Right. Yeah. And what they offered me was a year basically of like deferred. I forget what they call it exactly, but it was like this deferral thing, which basically said if I didn't get arrested again in the next year, that it would just be wiped off my record. But if I did, that I'd have that charge plus whatever the new charge was, and I'd have to deal with both of them. And
that's a common thing they always do.
Totally. Right. And so like, so I took it because it was like I didn't want to deal with any of that. I was young. My parents were in Oregon. I was in New York. I didn't want to like put them on to like get an attorney for them. I didn't even want to talk to them about it, to be honest. But I encountered that whole situation as a person with quite a bit of privilege, right? And so and my roommate, you know, he ended up doing the same thing, and neither one of us got in trouble in the next year, and it was fine. It was gone. It's not even on my record anymore. But like, that's an example of, you know, and then there were people in there that were so afraid. This was something that was telling me. I was sharing a cell in the precinct with a guy who was so afraid of going to Rikers again that he was trying to file his fingerprints off with like a rusty part of one of the bars, because he didn't want, when they ran his prints, he didn't want it to come up with past offenses that he had. And I also had another roommate at the time who had spent time at Rikers and had a similar, like, he was so afraid of the idea of going back to Rikers Island. And I couldn't understand it at the time. You know, this was before I had, you know, learned about Khalif Browder. It was way before Khalif Browder had happened. It was before I had a really strong understanding of Rikers Island. But like, that was sort of beyond like the later stuff in my life, learning about it. Like that firsthand experience was something that really at the time it got me fired up. And I thought, like, we need cameras everywhere in the hood to be able to see how the police act here, right? Because it was very clear to me, like, that their role was as like an occupying army, like filing through this area of the city to pull people into the jails. Like it was just obvious to me. And, the irony, right, is that years later we have that. We have cameras everywhere because everybody has cell phones, and the video evidence of it is still not enough to really indict the system or to cause the system to change itself, or to even draw enough like concern from your average person that that they say, oh yeah, we have to change the way that this happens. And so those are also part of how I became an abolitionist too, is because it was this realization that like just even showing it to people is sometimes not enough. And so it's a constant struggle to get people to really acknowledge what is going on. And a lot of that takes them actually taking some time to challenge some of those like closely held beliefs that they have about, how the system works and why it functions that way.
Yeah, and it's even harder in a prison because all the cameras allowed are owned by the prison, and they can make people too afraid to talk about what's been done to them. And the stuff that we see is so minimal. You gotta imagine how much terrible, torturous, just crooked stuff they're doing that we don't even hear about most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the prison context is horrible, and I think that when one of the telling things to me, I do some writing about prisons. Brian Sonnenstein, who I work with at Shadowproof, does a lot of writing about prisons. And we've, in different ways, we've figured out ways to get in touch with different people who are incarcerated and get some of their stories out. Brian has done a lot of that work, really good work that way. But I think that like there's some fundamental, really horrible issues with that idea with prisons, and one of them is that like prisoners don't have the same freedom of speech that we do. Like they don't have the access to it, and they don't have access to media like legally, you know what I mean? So it's like they can't just say, hey, let me call up the New York Times and tell them what's going on in here. They'll actually get in trouble for doing that. They'll actually get repressed for doing that. And so like with the prison strike, you have people from the Free Alabama movement, Kinetic Justice and MNOO, Hannibal Ross' son, who are still in solitary confinement, have still been moved around to multiple prisons that are called things internally like the bully camp, to be and to like these weird, like they have these things called hot bays within the prison where they'll put like multiple people together in a solitary confinement cell that's like 140 degrees, like all kind, like just really messed up things. And there's no real avenue for people to get access to that information. Smuggled cell phones do happen, but that is something where prisoners putting themselves at a lot of risk and will likely receive some sort of extreme repression or punishment for it as soon as the state finds out that they have it, right? So it's like it's not a
contraband, just like anything else.
Yeah, it's contraband, and on top of that, like the way it gets used, right, is if they do a report with some, like it's often foreign media that are more willing to talk to incarcerated people than our own media. And so like Al Jazeera Frontlines has done like a good report on the Free Alabama movement. RT did some decent coverage of the prison strike. And so there's people, I mean, there have been groups within the U.S. certainly, and like around Rikers, there was some good coverage because it's kind of a media hub, and there's some papers there with some real investigative resources, right, that can kind of dig into stuff and expose what's going on. But like what goes on in Rikers Island goes on in your county jail. It goes on in your state prison. It goes on in your federal prison. Right now you're seeing prisoners that are being abused for raising the circumstances that are going on in these hurricanes, that, where people are literally drinking toilet water because they can't get any clean water to drink. And, they're going to the bathroom in bags. And they know that the water that's in the toilet will give them some type of disease, but like they're that thirsty. They're starving, and their thirst is like that like they don't see any other alternatives. And when they raise this, when they expose it, then they get repressed as a result of it. As a person in the media, like, you kind of have to just keep exposing it though, right? Because it's like, it's the only way they get their story out, and then exposing the repression again shines light on that. But, it's a hard thing because, like, without that video, right, then, it doesn't draw the same kind of mass attention. And because, like, as a society, literally, when we put people in prisons, we're throwing them away. We don't consider them anymore our equals. We don't. And so, that's a part that's really interesting and difficult, is that even though on a yearly basis, 12 million people cycle in and out of the criminal justice system, that for some reason in our mindset, we think that when people are in there, that, like, they don't exist as regular humans. They don't have the same basic human rights that all of us have. And that's the struggle really to shift, right? Is to get people to understand, like, no, that could be you. It could be anybody.
Yeah.
It has to do with the circumstances of their lives and where they ended up. And they may have made bad decisions, but have any of us, like, never made a bad decision or never done anything that could have had us convicted of something? I think that we all have, if we're being honest. And so I think that that's the part that's difficult for people to really get past, is it's like, you can't treat them differently. I mean, I understand that, like, if you believe in the criminal justice system and you believe that it serves some sort of purpose, okay. But there still has to be these fundamentals of human rights around people that, like, when they go in prison, that they need to be treated with some decency and humanity. And I think, when we talk about things like slavery, when we talk about things like solitary confinement, which the UN has said is torture, these are not things that you do to private citizens or to anybody who we consider a human, and it's okay. I always think it's interesting to raise, like, that solitary confinement is illegal if you do it to an animal. You literally cannot legally put an animal in a small confined space or a cage by itself. Like, even if you're doing like testing on animals, like scientific testing and stuff like that, you can't do it. It's against the law. But we can do it to human beings and like basically melt their brains, and it's acceptable. So it's baffling to me how we justify some of these things.
Yeah, you said everyone's made a mistake here or there, but even more so than that, like just recently, and how many times have we seen police planting evidence, planting a gun, altering evidence to make somebody guilty? Yeah.
There's this documentary that I was just watching that just came out on Netflix, which is pretty good too, which is about confessions. And it's about, how bad the practice and the science around confessions even is. That, like, a lot of people that confess to a crime, like, they didn't do it, It's just like the circumstances and the way that is set up to them, it seems like the only way out, And so they'll admit to things that they didn't do that don't even make sense within the context of the crime that was actually committed. And I think in some ways that's what's amazing about, like, the story of Khalif Browder, is that he could have been out of jail if he had just said, yeah, I stole the backpack. But, like, because he wouldn't admit to doing something that he didn't do, his life was ruined and he eventually died, And I think that's how messed up the system is that the person who stands on their principles when they don't do something wrong is a lot of times treated much worse than the person who admits to doing something that they didn't do. And so that's really, when you think about how the contradictions within it and how messed up it is, that's a great way, I think, to expose it. And like you say, I mean, there's planning evidence. The Ferguson report reveals all kinds of things. I mean, there's all sorts of things where, like, fines can eventually lead to you ending up in jail for a certain period of time. Once you're in the system too, like, and this is part of the thing around slavery, is that if you don't follow all the rules of the system and try to play the good role all the time, then you may never get out of it, And so like the piece about why somebody might volunteer to be a firefighter, well, they might get some good time credits for that, or they might be able to get their, favorable review when they go up for parole, and be able to show that they're, quote unquote reformed and contributing to society now. So it's like, it's not even necessarily that they do it because they want to do it. It's that they do it because it's the only way that they see to get out of this horrible place. And I think that all those things are key, but definitely in terms of what you said, there's very little like scientific sort of inquiry into like, how many people in prison actually like, I mean, how do we know? How do you know how many people in prison actually committed a crime? You really don't, right? It's just, It's based on a system that is structured in such a way that once the state decides that you've done something, that they have all the power to actually get you into prison. And unless you have the money and the resources and the proof to exonerate yourself, then you're going to end up there. So, that's really the harsh reality of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's touch on abolition for the last little part of this. But real quick, earlier you said that the issue with abolition some people might have is for ultra-violent criminals and rapists and things like that. And I think my opinion is one of the answers to that would be to get better mental health care in this country, because a lot of those things could be dealt with medically, I think, before there's a problem, instead of just locking somebody up after there's a problem. I mean, I was talking to Ray Johansson on a show a while back, and he said when he's from Norway, but he said when he looks at America, he sees a country where they give everybody guns and give nobody mental health care.
Totally.
And he said that's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of go into what abolition is and how it could probably help if possible.
Sure. So, and I think abolition and socialism go very well together. So I'll kind of touch on that a little bit. But, as a concept, abolition, and I like to talk about abolition a little bit as two-pronged, because this is the way that a lot of the prisoners I talk to consider it, right? One is the actual abolition of slavery, which is actually saying that, dealing with the 13th Amendment, dealing with slavery in this country, and saying that nobody should be enslaved, regardless of whether they're incarcerated or not, that anybody that has to enter into a work relationship around something should be compensated fairly for their labor. And so I think that's one, and that would actually lead to real abolition of slavery in the United States, basically, which we don't really have when you consider how many people are incarcerated and the way the constructs of their labor arrangements. It's a form of slavery. So that's an important thing to sort of start with, is just the idea of slavery abolition still being an important thing in 2017. The second part is around prison abolition. And so prison abolition is both a goal, and it is like it's a process, or it's a philosophy. It's a way of approaching moving towards that goal. And, basically at its core, like, are some great pieces like Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, which sort of just basically spend all their time interrogating prisons and pointing to the fact that really they're causing more harm than they are good in our society, that the impacts of prison and incarceration on society are not in fact positive, but they are actually negative. And that as you think about things that we should abolish, right? Like, so when we thought about chattel slavery as something that we abolish, like, people didn't say like, oh, let's reform it away. Let's make slavery a little bit better here and here. And then like, or some people might have, but those people would have been slave owners, right? But, basically that when you have a system that is so bad at its core that the goal is to do away with that system. Now, Angela Davis actually suggests, and I agree with this too, that like our society would actually be better if we just said immediately, like, there's no more prisons. Like, you can't do it. You can't lock people away for things that they do. And then you'd force people in society to have to figure out, how do we deal with the new issues that this poses, right? With 2.5 million more people in the workforce that we have to figure out how to support, with the healthcare issues like you raised that people have. But I think
an easy solution: cut CEO salaries and give it to the workers.
Yeah. And I think like the reality though, right, is that it's not going to happen like that, right? There's no magic switch we can flip that abolishes all prisons immediately, right? Like that's what a lot of us want that are in the movement, but we also look at it from like a practical mode. And so I support both abolitionists that are radical on the spectrum, that want to see it come down tomorrow. And I support abolitionists also that do insert themselves into reform spaces and conversations and are looking at, okay, if we're going to do reform, all of our reforms need to be focused on getting people out of prisons and on reducing the violence of prisons, and but primarily on like taking power and money and resources away from the system so that it shrinks, right? And so that's a lot of what abolition is actually like, because prison reform broadly doesn't mean anything really. I mean, you'll have people who say that they're for prison reform, that all they want to do is raise the salaries of corrections officers, pay for more quote unquote programs within prisons that are run by private detention centers and, for-profit companies, that want to build more prisons because they think that overcrowding is such an issue that we need to build more prisons. So there's a lot of really bad types of prison reform that actually support the growth of the prison industrial complex. And prison itself is a history of reform. So the idea of prison as the form of punishment came about as in a response to the death penalty, actually, because it used to be in society not that long ago, like, 1700s, that if you committed a crime, like, you might go into a little jail or a little locked up for a few days or months or whatever, but that was just until they determined what to do with you, right? And so what they did with you, they might have, decided to put you in a stock, and, it was usually like some form of like either public humiliation or it was like capital punishment, like, we're going to hang all these people. And those were the forms of punishment. And then somebody had the brilliant idea of like, oh, well, let's just lock them in prison and make them think about it for 100 years. And so that's really where prisons came from. And the whole basis of it, right? Everything that's been done scientifically about it, everything that's been studied about prisons, it shows that they don't work, that they don't achieve the goal that they set out to do, that they don't make society better or contribute to a more positive society. Yet we've continued. I mean, in the 90s, Bill Clinton literally like closed down public housing and redistributed that money into the building of prisons, right? So like we've literally as a society said, like, that's where we're going to invest our resources, is into the prison industrial complex, and not invest them into things like, free mental health care for all and health care for all and better education and free college. And you have to look at those things as tied together. So, and that's why I say that socialism and abolition go very well together, because I think that, they call for one another, right? You have to say, like, if people are all out of prison, that you're going to have a lot of people, just being honest, right? Not everybody within the group, but you're going to have a lot of people within the group that have a big set of issues that you have to figure out how you deal with as a society. But prison becomes the shortcut of that conversation, right? Prison just becomes, well, they're bad, so we lock them up. But that doesn't deal with the issue, right? It actually puts them in a space where they're able to terrorize and harm a bunch of other people too, and teach each other this type of violence and and then that comes back into society, right? And so it's actually like, it's kind of like, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like quarantining everybody that's got all different types of diseases together, and just letting their diseases like fester with one another and then bringing them back. It's like taking somebody who has the plague and putting them in a children's hospital and then sending all those children back into society. Like that's the way that I look at prisons. And so prison abolition just basically acknowledges like that is not the way to deal with it, that there have to be better ways. And the part of the reason why we don't know what those better ways are is because we have prisons, right? Like you can't create the alternative system. And I know a lot of people that do some great work, like Miriam Kaba, who's Prison Culture on Twitter. Like she does a lot of like work with supporting all these little projects that are kind of from an abolitionist lens. And there's a lot of other stuff like that to kind of show like alternatives and ideas and restorative justice work and get these pilots off the ground and show that they can be successful. And I think that's good stuff. But I also think it's kind of like people who build communes within capitalism, right? It's like it's sort of like it shows that something is possible, but it is limited ultimately by the constraints of the overall system still. And so I think that you want to support those types of projects. I think she does great work. I think all those organizations do great work and I support them. But fundamentally, like we still have to deal with the whole system as well. And I know she does. I'm not trying to like say that she doesn't at all. But I think that's abolition, right? It's both sides of that. It's both building the new world that you want, but also like just dealing with the part of the world that just needs to be abolished. It needs to be taken out. And so there's that. It's kind of two pronged, right? It's about creation and building a more vibrant community, and a community that has everything within it that people need. And then it is. And that's the fundamental piece too, right? Like it's like mental health care will deal with a lot of stuff, but we also have to deal with the fact that like people literally don't have all the resources that they need within society either. And like you say, guns. I mean, guns are a huge issue. I don't see guns going anywhere in American society with 300 million of them, and that's a really kind of difficult prospect to deal with. I was arguing with somebody about this yesterday, and so. That's not to say that we shouldn't fight that fight, but it's like it's trying to think strategically about what fights are most important to fight first. And I think healthcare for all, single payer, and getting mental health care wrapped into that, like that would be a big step. So it's both things, right? It's about promoting those really good policies and things that other countries do have that help keep people healthy and safe and ensure that they have that safety net that they need. And then it's also like just carving away whenever we can and exposing the horrible stuff that goes on inside prisons too, having, I think one of the things that prison abolition always needs to consider too is like, how many prison voices do we have at the table here? How many people do we have at the table that are either formerly imprisoned or are currently imprisoned that we can get their voice, get them brought into the conversation. And I try to do that with my writing, and also with our program when we can at Beyond Prisons, because I think that their voices are as strong, if not stronger, than a lot of others. We just don't get to hear them that much because of the dynamics of prison and how difficult it is to do it. But it is possible in today's world. I mean, there's people, I'm not going to call out names right now, but there are people on Twitter that are incarcerated, right? Because they have a cell phone. They figured out a way to interact on Twitter. And so like, you just have to, if you're interested in the world, you just have to dive into it and understand that, there's dangers in it. Anytime you're interacting with folks, then, you're putting them at risk. They're already at risk. But it's definitely something that like, I think it's important to include people that are incarcerated within that conversation, because I think a lot of times they know more than any of us, right, what the conditions are like inside, and they can tell the stories of the bad parts. They also can tell from a reformist perspective, what are some of the things that they need right now to be able to help them, and I think a lot of times we get in this situation where we let organizations like the ACLU say like, oh, well, this is the next initiative for prison reform. And they do it from this very like academic lawyerly perspective, as opposed to like actually real engagement with people in prisons. Like, what do you need? And I think that's important too.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, obviously the economic equality would eliminate people from having to do a lot of crime
Absolutely.
to survive. But when I brought up mental health before, I think that I was talking more about like the people, like serial killers and the people that they
Sure.
say, the people that have like an issue that's not economically driven or not for survival or not for even because they just want something, because they have a real issue or something. And those people could be dealt with mentally rather than locked away in prison.
And I think a couple of things with that. One, I would just always say for people when they think about things like serial killers, like that our media promotes that like this is a much more prominent thing than it is, right? They're so rare, right, in our society, people that are just like so messed up that they just like find pleasure in killing people.
Yeah, I just use that as an extreme example.
No, I know, totally. But I think it's important for people to know that, because those are the types of people that people will bring up in like the examples of why you need prisons, right? Is these extreme examples. And I think it's like, it's also like one thing to just challenge them to say like, name me 10 right now that are currently alive, and see if they can do it. Because it's like, you're in a society with 300 million people. And I know like for Norway, like that is the thing that they deal with, right? Because they're not incarcerating very many people, but they do have some people who are like, totally on that end of the spectrum. And I think that like, you're right. I mean, mental health early on in life is key. Mental health within schools is key, which we don't have good services for that. So all of those things can be prevention of that kind of thing. And then I think beyond that, I can't remember. You said something else that made me think about it, but I don't remember what it was.
If I said it, it probably wasn't that important. Yeah, you want to talk about the Millions for Prisoners March?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a really good event. It came at kind of a perfect time and kind of, I think, a challenging time, because it came right after Charlottesville, like the week after Charlottesville. And so, I think a lot of people's attention became on like, let's counter protest Nazis or right-wing groups in our area, or show solidarity for Heather Heyer. And so I think that took some attention away from the Millions for Prisoners March that probably should have been there. But I think it also, in some ways, made it more profound, right? Because it was the Millions for Prisoners March. What it ended up being is there was a brief march at the beginning I actually missed because I got down there late. I was coming down from Philly. But it was a rally in front of the White House that included people like, I'm going to forget his name. I think it's Yusuf Salam, but he was a member of the Central Park Five, actually talking about Donald Trump taking out a full-page ad to suggest that the death penalty should be brought back in a case that they were innocent of, right? Like they didn't actually, that was connected to a rape that happened in Central Park that they actually did not participate in, but they were railroaded by people like Donald Trump in the 90s into just horrible treatment and incarceration, and brutalized, and that's something that Akeem Browder can talk about too. Khalif's older brother, we had him on Beyond Prisons. But back to the march, like this rally. So it is this indictment of white supremacy and slavery on basically the White House lawn. It was in the park, Lafayette Park, which is right across the street there. But Ramona Africa was there, who is like she's the only living survivor of the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, which a lot of people don't know, but look it up. It was a terrorist attack from the Philadelphia PD. Then It had Mumia Abu Jamal, which, I actually regret we forgot to mention him in the piece that we did on Shadowproof about it. But there was a recording that he had prepared that was played for the march. There was, really interesting. There was a big contingent of Black Panthers and Black Liberation Army members, which, it's amazing to me that one, I mean, you're just sort of looking at it like, wow, it's amazing that you're free, because you're part of an organization that basically wanted full on revolution, right, in the 70s. And, the same group of people that Assata Shakur was connected to, who's still, a refugee with political asylum in Cuba. And there are still members of the Black Liberation Army that are still incarcerated, like Jalil Muntakim, and others. But basically, and still Panthers that are incarcerated. So there's still political prisoners that are currently incarcerated from their political activity in the late 60s and the early 70s. But you had all of those folks there. So you had a large contingent of people that were involved in that, had been incarcerated as a result of that because they've been targeted by COINTELPRO and the FBI. And then you had, younger abolitionists. Our piece that we had on Shadowproof, we focused a lot on April Goggins from Black Lives Matter DC. She's a great speaker, and she really had a good speech, like connecting, really talking about abolition work in the community. So just like, hey, stop calling police on each other, and what do we need in our community to stop doing that, which I think is something that I've taken out of it to try to, kind of bring to my block in Philly too, is like, because people call police on each other way too much, right? Like just for dumb stuff, like things that are
here too.
Yeah. It's like, for what? Like, why are you calling the police? Like, this guy needs, he needs help. He doesn't need the police right now. So that kind of stuff. But I think, and then the sort of one of the more powerful things to me is there were two members of the Angola Three. And so going back to that plantation that we talked about, that was really 4 plantations in Louisiana that were literally slave plantations where they built the first penitentiary for the state, and where slave quarters were the first lockups. These guys did a combined 71 to 75 years in solitary confinement, and one of them, Albert Woodfox, who didn't speak, but I got a chance to speak to him, and he did some interviews too. He was in for 44 years in solitary confinement and what they were in solitary confinement for, there was a trumped up charge that was BS of something that they did not do while they were inside. But what it was really about was that they were organizing a chapter of the Black Panther Party within the prison, and that they were fighting against the slavery, fighting against the slavery conditions that existed in the 20th century, and still in the 21st century in this prison. And, they got picked up. They eventually got a fairly large campaign for their release that even some very large, like Amnesty International organizations got behind. Robert King, who was the member who spoke, was the first one released. And then another member, and I cannot remember his name right now, but he was released because he had a health condition. He died right after he was released. They only released him temporarily because he had the health condition, but he died. And then Albert Woodfox, who was also there. And, Albert Woodfox had an interview with Real News Network. And he actually said that, he gets asked a lot, what's changed in the 44 years that you were in prison? And, he says, he basically says nothing significant, that, which is really interesting, because I think we talk a lot about the victories of the civil rights movement and the changes. And I think there are changes. There's fundamentally changes in society. But to him, he said the changes are very surface level. And he said, that's how I felt. He said, I feel like being in solitary for 44 years sharpened my powers of perception, and he said, my perception is that nothing fundamental has really changed, that all the changes are superficial. And then he said, and then Donald Trump comes along and proves my whole point, and so it was great. It was a gathering of just this big intergenerational gathering. It was called originally by Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, which is it's a group of imprisoned people who are human rights advocates, are legal advocates for other members. They help write writs, which is a way of trying to get, habeas corpus and people brought before a judge to maybe get their sentence reduced or deal with some type of repression they have, or possibly get them out on some sort of release, on some sort of technicality, things like that. So they're a great organization, and a great set of people. And they called it, and it's actually been a couple years in the works. It was called before the prison strike, but it kind of became the thing after the prison strike died down, that a lot of abolitionists that were involved in that end of abolition got involved in. So the Free Alabama movement supported it. IWOC, which is the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee of the International Workers of the World, they were there. They participated. Party for Socialism and Liberation was there. Black Lives Matter was there. And then a bunch of other, individuals and activists and groups and people. So it was really great. And I think for me, it was powerful just to see like this intergenerational thing and this struggle and just to hear, these stories and people that have been, profoundly negatively impacted by the system that are still fighting it. And its demands basically is just two demands. Their demand is one, to rewrite the 13th Amendment, which would be a big process and would require a ton of national involvement, to basically abolish abolish slavery outright in the country, right? Not have any caveats about it. And then the other thing is to call for Congress to call basically a hearing under UN international law to investigate slavery in the country, basically. And so, lofty demands, they see them as tactical and strategic, meaning that, they don't think that changing the 13th Amendment will change everything overnight. And they know that it's a big struggle. It's not going to be easy to attain either, but they think that there's a lot of people that are aware of it now and focused on it and concerned about it. So, it's a good thing to draw people's attention towards. It's a good thing to keep fighting for, whether it's on a local level, a state level, or a federal level. And then I think for them, like, they also see, like, ultimately they're prison abolitionists as well. They're also people that, believe in like real revolutionary change in this country too. So, it's a part of them of trying to continue to build that movement within prison sectors, because there's a lot of like, within the broader prison reform movement that, like I said before, it's all over the place, and within abolition, frankly, there's a lot of different sort of factions too, right? So it's kind of, their goal is to kind of try to bring people together around this issue. And what's interesting to me is how many people just like won't touch the issue with a 10-foot pole, which I think is really, really interesting. I mean, I think that, there's arguments that can be made, sort of legal arguments around like that there's other things that cause the labor conditions in prisons that are different than the 13th Amendment. But I think that like, even if you feel that way, the amount of momentum that you would create by actually changing the Constitution around the 13th Amendment, it would force everybody to like deal with those issues, right? Like you would have to deal with county law and state law and prison policy, like, because you'd have to really acknowledge and being willing to admit that there's slavery within prisons, right? And I think that like they don't even want to go there. A lot of people, they'll make an argument that like, well, it's like it's volunteer work, or it's helpful for them. It's part of their rehabilitation to be paid nothing,
Wow.
So it's a complicated world. But I thought the event was great. There were solidarity marches that that happened all around the country. I think in like 19 locations, and the organizers are going to continue and they're going to push forward. I Am We is the organization on the outside that helped set it all up and make it happen after Jailhouse Lawyers Speak made that call. So like they'll continue to move forward and be a key voice, I think, within prison abolition circles and with future actions. And the thing I like too is that they really do bring together abolitionists on the outside with that direct connection into prisoner voices as well, because they're people that their movement really started with direct connections to people that are within prisons. So they don't make decisions without considering what prisoners have to say about it. Prisoners have a key voice at that table at all times, and probably the most prominent one. So I think they're a great organization, and they're going to continue to be a leader in that way. And then there was solidarity on the inside in prisons, and there's been repression on the inside in prisons. And that's something that I'm still trying to investigate and work on a report about. But it's difficult because, sometimes when people are repressed, they don't want to talk about their repression because they're afraid that it'll mess up their case and things like that. So, those conversations are being had, but it in multiple states, I can say that people that were inside were, punished just as the fact that the march happened, even though the march happened on the outside. And I think that that's a very, when you think about sort of the fascist and just generally messed up nature of prisons, that's a telling thing, right? That somehow somebody in prison could be punished for somebody who's not in prison exercising their free speech rights. I don't understand how that's even possible.
Yeah, I think as long as we have these mega corporations profiting off prisons and being able to lobby our government, it's going to be an uphill battle the whole way. But
absolutely,
yeah. What should and could people be doing that are listening to this right now to get involved and help out?
Yeah, so I think one thing is to really educate yourself. I do think that a plug for our podcast. I think that Beyond Prisons is a good place to go to get a lot of like kind of background knowledge. We have episodes that just really lay out the fundamentals of abolition. We have episodes where we're talking to a lot of scholars. We have episodes where we talk to prisoners, and so that's a good place to get like more information if you're not somebody who wants to read a bunch of books. We also recommend books on there and talk about books on there, so that it can refer you to those as well.
Yeah, those are really good podcasts. I was listening to some yesterday that you sent me. Where do people go to find them? Can you give them all the info to find that real quick before you go on?
Yeah, so there's a couple. So one is Beyond Prisons, which you can just find that by looking us up on iTunes. It's also on shadowproof.com, Beyond Prisons on shadowproof.com. On Twitter, the handle is beyond_prison, singular. So it's not prisons on there. It's beyond_prison. So all of those places you can find our podcast. I think the ones I sent you yesterday were actually Rust Belt Abolition Radio, which is another that's another prison abolitionists podcast that's also excellent, and I really encourage people to listen to them too. So that's another one, and I think they're Rust Belt Radio online, but I could be wrong about that. But
on
if you
Twitter,
look up,
it's Rust Belt Radio.
Okay, yep. And then you can just look up Rust Belt Abolition Radio, and you can find it too. So those are two good like podcasts that are connected to it. Critical Resistance is an organization that you can Google and look up, and they have a lot of resources for people to learn more about abolition. If you also Google prison abolition syllabus, there's a full academic syllabus of like all kinds of sources connected to it. I also always encourage people to Google free abolition Free Alabama Movement, Let the Crops Rot in the Field, because that's a document that sort of talks about prison strikes and why they are a tactical measure to resist the prison industrial complex. There's an organization that's called IWOC, which I talked about a little bit. I think their website now is incarceratedworkers.org. But you can just look up Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. So they're another abolitionist organization that I encourage people to check out. Jailhouse Lawyers Speaks. Twitter is Jail Law Speak. Or is it Speaks? Jail Law Speaks, I think. It's at Jail Law Speaks at Twitter. And then they are also on, if you look up Jailhouse Lawyers Speak on Facebook, they have a page there too. So those are a couple. And then if you also look up I Am We, Millions for Prisoners, if you Google that, you'll find that organization I was referring to before that started the Millions for Prisoners or brought the Millions for Prisoners March into existence. So those are some good places to check out. Free Alabama Movement in general is a good thing to look at, although they're so repressed right now that there's not a lot of recent material that's come out from them at all. Although MNOO has written some recent pieces in SF Bayview, San Francisco Bayview, and that's a really good paper for people to look at if they want incarcerated abolitionist perspectives, because they print them all the time. So those are some sources for people to definitely reach out. In terms of getting involved, there are, different campaigns that.
Sorry, we had something went wrong and we got cut off of Skype. So Jay, you're still here?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Go ahead. You were talking about the different organizations and stuff and what people could do to help.
Yeah, so just in terms of, they all have like different campaigns that are going on as well, and you can kind of look at those and look at ways to support. And I just encourage people to be open-minded with those campaigns too, because these are people that are connected directly into the movement, working directly with prisoners, and have their interests directly at heart. Whereas some of the other organizations that you might want to donate to that are like larger reform organizations, they have a ton of bureaucracy and structure, and reality is you probably can make more good by donating to one of these smaller, grassroots organizations that are connected to the movement. So, if you're interested in a sort of monetary thing, I encourage you to look into the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, to look into I Am We and Millions for Prisoners, and to look into Free Alabama Movement as organizations that you can support.
Cool. I thank you for coming on today. It was really good. There's so much information. Maybe in the future, if you have some time, you can come back and we can go deeper into some stuff. But is there anything you want to say as like a last kind of statement, or something you think we missed or forgot for this episode?
No, thank you for having me on, Tim, and I'd definitely love to come back and talk with you more sometimes, either on another subject or in deeper on one of these areas. That in terms of a final statement, I'd just say for people to really look into prison abolition a little more deeply, and think about it not from the sense of like, we have to have prisons. Like, really interrogate the idea of why do we have to have prisons, and really think about the questions of like, what else could we do instead, and how would we deal with these issues, and also like just consider that when you look in the world, how disproportionate the U.S. prison system is to its population globally, and realize that there are other things at play within the U.S. prison industrial complex that are connected to, our history of racism, that are connected to for-profit dynamics and slavery dynamics, that are bigger than just prisons in other countries. And all of that to say that I don't think prisons are the right answer anywhere. But you have to at least start from the place of understanding that like our prison system is way worse than what's going on anywhere else, really, and sort of understand that. And I think once you start to understand that and dig in, then you learn more about it, and you start to see a lot of these things and how they play. And you kind of, I think that abolition is something that just sort of people come to by encountering all the sets of circumstances together. It's not usually one thing that's going to make somebody an abolitionist. It's usually really understanding everything about prisons in America and prisons in the world.
Yeah, it seems the more I know, the more pissed off I get about it.
Yeah, me too.
Well, cool. I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to ask everyone listening to follow Jay, and that's at JayBeware on Twitter. That's at JayBeware. And thanks again. It was a really great, informative show. And
Thank you.
see the listeners next time. Thanks again.